to introduce Professor Prabhat Patnaik, but I think I am short of words because we all know who Prabhat is, and also a professor for more than 30 years at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, a great Marxian thinker, and a voracious speaker with respect to alternate economics, has been in the realm of critiquing capitalism as well as neoliberal reforms agenda with specific special attention. Very brief phrase, let us welcome sir for that talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for asking me to come and speak to this very distinguished relatively senior group. I found from the introductions that there were about 6 students who had not done economics, I think 4 from political science and a couple from history and some other disciplines. I would, however, like to assure you that I would really keep it at a level where I do not go beyond national income identities, which I would explain, and also I do not go beyond class 5 level of mathematics, algebra. So, but I want to do this because I'm very serious about this course. I think, let me begin by making a claim that will explain why I'm so serious about the course. Virtually everything that is said about neoliberalism in official, I don't just mean Indian, in international official media circles is theoretically wrong. Now, I'm making this very strong statement extremely responsibly, and I'll tell you why it is wrong. It's very simple. Long ago, János Kornai, who's a Hungarian economist, had drawn a distinction between what he called demand-constrained systems and resource-constrained systems. Now, resource-constrained systems, we can, for simplicity, refer to it as supply-constrained system. In other words, in opposition to a demand-constrained system, we can talk in terms of a supply-constrained system. Now, what does a supply-constrained system mean? A demand-constrained system is one in which, if there is a higher level of aggregate demand, then output and employment would be higher. Therefore, the system is constrained. Where it is because demand is what it is. If demand had been higher, in that case, the system would have a higher level of output and employment. Implicit in this is the fact that you would have unutilized labor, that is unemployment, and unutilized production capacity lying around wherever the system happens to rest. Now, that is typical of a demand-constrained system. As distinct from this, a supply-constrained system, or what I'm calling a supply-constrained system, is one in which any increase in demand would give rise to inflation because there is either a shortage of labor because the economy is at full employment, or there is a shortage of capacity, productive capacity, because even if there is unutilized labor, the system cannot produce any more because there is no unutilized capacity. Now, one of Keynes's remarkable contributions was to recognize that capitalism was typically a demand-constrained system. He actually said that apart from, I'm virtually quoting him, apart from brief periods of excitement, it is a system where there is always idle capacity and idle labor which is lying around. Brief periods of excitement is when you have high levels of investment, and because of that high levels of demand, and because of that the system actually reaches the constraint of either capacity or full employment, full capacity or full employment. Keynes's fundamental contribution, and this is also true of Kaleski, who actually discovered the same results independently. The Kaleskian Keynesian revolution recognized not only that in the 1930s capitalism was a demand constrained system, but that typically it is always a demand constrained system. Now, then Keynes suggested that, look, this demand constrained system, I was saying this yesterday, he was worried that if the workers remain unemployed, then they may too take the route of the Bolshevik revolution. So he said it's very important that the economy should provide full employment. That is, convert the demand constrained system to a supply constrained system. In other words, there should be no idle manpower lying around. Now, every proposition, every theoretical proposition which is put forward either for export-led growth or for free trade or in favor of neoliberal economic policies is based on the presumption that the economy we are talking about is a supply constrained system, which it is not. Okay, so fundamentally what I propose to do is to discuss with you the properties of a demand constrained system, which actually imply that the neoliberal and other such policies of export-led growth and this and that are policies that really inapposite for such a system. Now, one can actually say that if you want to look at very briefly the history of capitalism, that because of the adoption of Keynesian demand management policies in the post-Second World War period, when governments intervened in generating demand, which was financed by fiscal deficits and so on, you actually managed to push the economy, push the capitalist economy as close to full employment as possible. In other words, really, when I was a student, when I turned up in Britain, unemployment level was 2%, less than 2%, just marginally less than 2%, which is virtually full employment. Therefore, the post-war capitalism, under the impact of social democracy, because this was actually done by the Labour Party and other social democratic parties that came to power in Europe after the war, you actually pushed the economy, the capitalist economy, from a demand-constrained system, which it had actually become acutely in the interwar period because of the Great Depression, to a supply-constrained system in the post-war period. But of course, as I said, there are fundamental constraints on why a capitalist economy cannot function as a supply-constrained system. There is a fundamental contradiction between the existence, the law of motion, the logic of a capitalist economy and its being a supply-constrained system. And this is something which manifested itself in an inflationary upsurge which actually took place starting from the very late 1960s in the early 1970s. And that was the beginning when you actually had, in response to that inflationary crisis, the suggestion that capitalism, I mean, nobody put it in that language, but capitalism should fundamentally once more become a demand-constrained system. And the neoliberal economic policies were designed to convert capitalism back into a demand-constrained system. I'm saying not that anybody talked that way, but this is an extrinsic reading of the kind of reforms that took place. Not surprisingly, the period of, let's say, two decades or a little bit more after the Second World War has been referred to as the golden age of capitalism, because at a time when the demand constraint was overcome, capitalism functioned very close to capacity for a while. It actually recorded the highest growth rates ever recorded in the history of capitalism for a comparable period. So that's why it's referred to as the golden age of capitalism. But with the onset of the inflation and the response to the inflation in the form of the neoliberal policies which were imposed everywhere in the world, I was saying yesterday, under the aegis of globalized finance capital, you actually had the reconversion of capitalism to a demand constraint system, quite independent of the crisis. The demand constraint system implies that at every moment of its existence, it is a demand constraint system, and not surprisingly, the growth rates of the world capitalist economy have really come down compared to what it was during the golden age of capitalism. Now, my theoretical objections to all that, let us say, you would have been exposed to and so on, is that all such theory treats capitalism as a supply constraint system, while it is in fact a demand constraint system. That's why all these theories are wrong. Just mention any one and you'd find that it is actually wrong. And I would try to devote the coming lectures today and then the following two lectures to explaining why particularly these theories are wrong, particularly that we really have to be very careful about, thinking about economic issues the way that we are encouraged to do normally in the literature and so on. Let me, to kind of, arouse your interest, let me give you an illustration. Now, I believe in the morning you had lectures on economic history topic. You see, the Ricardian theory of comparative advantage, quite apart from the fact that you have Britain can't produce wine and all that there are false assumptions on the basis of which comparative advantage is calculated. Ricardian theory is based on the assumption that capitalism is a supply constraint system. It's based on the assumption that it observes what is called Say's law. Say's law rules out any demand constraint. Say's law states that supply creates its own demand. Whatever is supplied would be automatically demanded. And if that is the case, then the limit of the system is what it can supply. Demand cannot independently pose a limit. Now, Ricardo was a great believer in Say's law, and therefore Ricardo treated capitalism not as a demand constraint system, and therefore what you observe through trade is something that simply cannot be captured by Ricardo's theory of trade based on comparative advantage. For instance, something called deindustrialization, which you must have heard about in the morning, is impossible to conceive. In other words, something that generates unemployment is impossible to conceive under the Ricardian assumptions, because the Ricardian assumptions are ones that really believe in Say's law and so on, that there's always, that labor is employed as long as there is enough wage goods available, you can employ labor and so on. The fact that you can't employ labor because even though wage goods may be available, what can the labor produce? Because what the labor can produce is something which is unsaleable in the market, is something which Ricardo would not have recognized. So let me kind of begin with a discussion of neoliberalism in terms of this distinction which I drew between demand and supply constraint systems. By the way, classical capitalism was a demand constraint system, while classical socialism, what existed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and so on, was actually a supply constraint system. Kornai, as I said, was a Hungarian economist. He was studying the Hungarian economy, and he re-established this definition, this distinction, in order to emphasize that really socialist economies function in a way very different from the way that we understand capitalist economies too. In fact, he wrote extensively on it. In socialist economies, you actually had scarcity. You actually had queues. The fact that in a socialist economy you invariably had queues for all kinds of goods is something that actually says that there is an excess demand for all kinds of goods. And the excess demand for all kinds of goods gives rise to rationing. And of course, if you have rationing, there'll be queues. And that basically implies that it was not a demand constraint system, it was a supply constraint system. Gordon and I wrote books like Economics of Scarcity and so on in order to study the Hungarian economy, but fundamentally this distinction is something which I want you to keep in mind. I see. But you don't have a board here normally. I mean, I just need the board in order to write out the identities and so on. National income identity.
There is a big board which we cannot carry right
now. Oh. No, but you don't have a small one.
Department.
Anyway, leave it then.
Tomorrow we'll learn. Tomorrow there would be not today.
Okay. Now, basically, when we had the introduction of neoliberal economic policies, what the neoliberal economic policies meant was relatively free flows of goods and services and of capital, including finance, across country borders. Okay. Now, this was completely new. In the pre-neoliberal period, which was the period of the Bretton Woods arrangement, and Keynes was one of the authors of the Bretton Woods system. Keynes and Harry White, the American representative, they were the chief persons to set up the Bretton Woods system, IMF, World Bank and all these. The rules of the game under the Bretton Woods system were such that you actually had very strict controls on trade flows, that governments could actually impose controls on trade flows. You could protect your economy, not just through tariffs, through quantitative restrictions on imports. You could similarly have quantitative restrictions on exports, and so on. Similarly, you had absolute restriction on financial flows, and even on capital that was brought into the country in order to make investments. In other words, I'm not talking about financial flows, but the flows of capital in production. You also had very strict scrutiny. You actually had to apply for licenses and so on, and your proposal was scrutinized. So the Bretton Woods system, and every country had it, the Bretton Woods system was characterized by very strict restrictions on free flows, or on flows of goods and services across countries, and on the flow of capital, including finance, across countries. This went with neoliberalism. At the same time, you actually had governments being restricted in a way that they had been in the earlier period during the gold standard, that really governments could not run fiscal deficits. Now, the fallacy behind this thinking is something which I'm going to talk tomorrow, but the point is that governments were not allowed to run fiscal deficits in the gold standard years. Now, that means under neoliberalism, most governments are allowed to run a fiscal deficit, but only up to 3% of the GDP. So really from 0 to 3, but fundamentally, it actually puts a constraint on the ability of the government to run a fiscal deficit. So the main economic features of neoliberalism are free movements of goods and capital and finance and everything across country borders, but every country has a government whose hands are tied, at least in the matter of fiscal deficit. If the government can tax, very good. In that case, with 3%, you can actually have more government expenditure, but not otherwise. Now, this has a number of implications. The first implication is that if finance is mobile across countries. It can go in a jiffy from one country to another. In that case, governments everywhere become obsessed with the idea of retaining the confidence, or what is called confidence of investors. In other words, in ensuring that finance does not really leave your country, that actually there is no financial outflow, and that can happen only if you can keep finance happy. And to keep finance happy, therefore, you have to pursue policies which finance likes. In other words, the fact that a country is exposed to free financial flows into it or out of it implies that government policy gets geared to pleasing, appeasing, ensuring that finance remains happy, does not leave your country. Now, this has very important implications. One implication, which I was talking about yesterday in the context of Syriza in Greece, a left-wing formation that came to power, but ended up pursuing exactly the same policies that everybody else did. Now, the point is that it implies that all political formations, as long as they remain within the confines of this arrangement where finance is free to move in and out of the country, all political formations more or less pursue the same policies. Okay? Obviously, because of the fact that if you do not, then finance is going to leave your country, and if it leaves your country, then you are in deep trouble. So, tomorrow in India, if by chance the Naxalites come to power, as long as they remain within the confines of a neoliberal arrangement with free flows of finance, they will be pursuing more or less exactly the same policies as the Congress or the Manmohan Singh government or the Modi government have been pursuing. Okay? So, now this has very important implications for democracy, because democracy implies the choice before the people between alternative formations. Different formations come with their own agendas, and of course, people choose between these agendas. Some agendas they like, in which case they vote for that particular formation. Some agendas they don't, in which case they vote against that. So democracy or popular sovereignty presupposes that the people must have a choice. The people must meaningfully be able to make up their minds about which particular political formation they wish to have. But if people are denied this choice, then that's the end of democracy. And if the country remains within the confines of a neoliberal arrangement where finance is free to move across country borders, in that case, they are effectively denied this choice. This is what has happened in most advanced countries. This is what has happened in India. In India, for instance, we had originally the Narasimha Rao government, then we had the United Front government, then we had the BJP government, then we again had a Congress government. In terms of economic policies, it is true that you can actually have very minor variations, because after all these things take time to kind of manifest themselves. Contradictions take time to manifest themselves. But on the other hand, when they do manifest themselves, they pose a problem before the government, whether to pursue with the policies. Let me give you an example. Tomorrow, suppose the Indian government imposes a wealth tax. Okay, finance is not to like it. Therefore, it would start moving out. And when finance starts moving out, the government is faced with a choice. Either withdraw the wealth tax, or alternatively, put a control on financial outflows. If you put a control on financial outflows, in that case, you're opting out of the neoliberal arrangement. Okay? And there are innumerable such cases. In South Africa, after the end of apartheid, when Nelson Mandela became the president of the country, there were every day millions of dollars flowing out of South Africa because of the fact that finance lost its nerve. What is going to happen with Mandela's presidency? Because of which Mandela appointed as his first finance minister the same man who had been the finance minister under the apartheid regime, a man called Derek Keyes. So, I can give you other examples. I mean, Syriza was one obvious example. And sometimes, of course, to appease finance, you have to have as your finance minister at least, even as prime minister, a person who is acceptable to finance. Derek Keyes was acceptable to finance. Likewise, you may have to appoint somebody who is acceptable to finance. Typically, for instance, a World Bank bureaucrat, someone who is a retired or resigned or retired or kind of temporarily on leave World Bank employee or IMF employee. Pakistan has had 2 prime ministers who are actually ex-IMF employees. And why is that the case? Not because they are particularly loved by the Pakistani people, because they are hardly known. But on the other hand, it's because you have to appease finance, and appeasing finance becomes an extremely important goal in a neoliberal economy. Keynes was opposed to that. As I said, Keynes wanted the state to have the autonomy to intervene in demand management, but of course, therefore, having free movement of finance is fundamentally anti-Keynesian. And that is why under the Bretton Woods system there was no free movement of finance. And Keynes wrote a very interesting article in 1933 in a journal called the Yale Review, in which he talks about, the article was called National Self-Sufficiency. What should a country, how much should it be integrated with the rest of the world, in which he actually argues, let finance remain national. That means finance is not allowed to be international. Have a look at Keynes' Yale Review article because it's available on the net and it's easy to read and so on. Okay, so the first thing that happens therefore is if finance is globalized while the state remains nation state, in that case, it becomes very important for the nation state to appease finance because otherwise it will leave the country, and therefore to pursue policies which are pleasing as far as finance is concerned. And this is something which is fundamentally anti-democratic, because instead of the sovereignty of the people, this is actually catering to the sovereignty of globalized finance. Instead of actually looking after the interests of the people, even elected governments are really very keen. I'm not saying out of any bad intention, simply they are compelled to be keen to ensure that they look after the interests of globalized finance. Now there is one very important implication of this, which, two very important implications of it. One important implication is that for a very long time in India and elsewhere, but in India, let us say, other third world countries, because of the long anti-colonial struggle, which was a multi-class struggle, which actually took off. The anti-colonial struggle in India took off in the 1930s when the peasantry joined it in great numbers because the peasantry was distressed by the Great Depression. There had been a collapse of agricultural prices, the peasants had got into debt, and therefore they joined the national movement, the anti-colonial struggle, in large numbers. And one of the promises the anti-colonial struggle had made is that come independence, you never again have to face a problem of the kind you are facing today. And that is why, after independence, all kinds of measures were taken to protect the peasants, to protect small producers, to protect the handloom weavers and so on. We know that, for instance, there were restrictions on the amount of cloth that the mills could manufacture. The rest was given to the handloom sector, a decentralized sector, handlooms and powerlooms. We also know that as far as the peasantry is concerned, we had this whole system of procurement prices, support prices, procurement operations, not just for food crops, but also for cash crops, in the sense that you had the tea board, coffee board, rubber board, coir board, and so on, which all intervened in years whenever there was a price crash. And that is something which was to make sure that the peasantry did not suffer, the producers did not suffer the consequences of these price crashes. Now, similarly, you actually had research in government laboratories which produced new practices, high-yielding varieties of seeds and so on, and these were distributed to the peasantry or to the farmers more generally through an extension mechanism which was the largest in the world. You can imagine, enormous extension mechanism which the government had, through which new practices used to be disseminated to the farmers. Now all that is gone. Extension mechanism has been virtually wound up. Much of the research in government laboratories on new practices and new seeds has been abandoned. These days the farmers are going to agribusiness, to Monsanto and such like corporations in order to get their seeds, and they impose their own conditions. And what is more, we know that in cash crops, this entire system of procurement and price support has been completely abandoned. The boards exist, but the marketing functions of the boards have been removed. Similar effort was made as far as food grains were concerned, but of course we know that the farmers' agitation, year-long agitation by farmers, forced the government's hands and it could not carry it through. But let's be very clear, this is part of the neoliberal agenda. It is not the malevolence of a particular government that it wanted to abandon the support price mechanism, but this is something which is part of the neoliberal agenda, and a government that slavishly follows that agenda, which is a blame you can put on the current government, that it slavishly follows a neoliberal agenda, was therefore keen to follow it and therefore wanted to remove the procurement support mechanism from food grains as well, the 23 crops or something for which such a mechanism still exists. By the way, there are enormous pressures from the WTO for India to abandon its entire procurement operation, but governments till now have not dared to do this because of the fact that the peasants are so powerful as a political force. But of course, they would, if they pursued the neoliberal agenda, would be more or less doing it. Anyway, the upshot is that a whole range of support which the state extended, not just to labor. We know that the state extended some support to labor. Tripartite agreements were there about labor conditions and so on. Some of the support the state had extended to labor, it had extended to peasants, it had extended to petty producers, is now withdrawn. And this is something which is a very important change that comes about in the nature of the state under neoliberalism. In other words, the state under neoliberalism becomes committed, not out of necessarily any ill will, it becomes committed to supporting, promoting the interests of capital in general, particularly globalized capital in general, while it withdraws from its role of supporting and protecting the peasants, petty producers, and so on. And this basically also implies that capital is allowed to encroach on the petty producers, production on the domain of the petty producers. Rosa Luxemburg had argued long ago that this is in fact a property of capital. It is in fact a characteristic property of capital. This characteristic property is something which was kept in check by the government in the post-independence period in a large number of third world countries, but this, under the impact of neoliberalism, is progressively being abandoned. Now that's a very important factor. I'll come back to it later. The second consequence of neoliberalism, neoliberal economic policies, is the fact that the level of activity in the economy, that means how much output is produced, how much employment is generated, the level of economic activity in the economy becomes subject to the caprices of international finance. Why is that? Suppose for some reason finance decided to leave the country, okay, because maybe they think that, you know, Rahul Gandhi is too radical for their liking or something, and so they decide to leave the country. If finance decides to leave the country, in that case, how do you pay for finance leaving the country? Let me ask, sorry, this is where the board would have come in useful, but tomorrow. Okay. Now let us begin with a hypothetical situation where the external, the current account deficit on the balance of payments, that is exports minus imports, is zero. In other words, we have current balance in the balance of payments, just as a starting point. Now suppose finance wants to leave the country, so you have to find the foreign exchange to kind of let finance go out of the country. Now if you have to find that foreign exchange, in that case you have to earn that foreign exchange. Either you borrow it, either you go to the international market and borrow, let's say $100 somebody wants to take out of the country. In that case, you may have to go to the market and borrow $100, give it to the fellow who wants to leave the country and say go, or alternatively, you have to earn or somewhere generate these $100. That means any such, or you have to run down your reserves by $100. Now suppose it is the case that you don't have enough reserves to run down. In that case, if, by the way, in terms of macroeconomic identities, if someone takes $100 out and the government or the Reserve Bank of India pays those $100 by running down in its reserves, that basically means there is zero net outflow of capital, because our reserves are claims on other people. So if $100 are being taken out by somebody and we run down our reserve, that means we reduce our claims on other people by $100. So $100 is being taken by somebody and $100 we are reducing our claims on somebody else, which basically means that there is zero net outflow of finance, and in other words, in the capital account there is zero net outflow. But suppose this is not the case, we don't have enough reserves or we don't want to run it down. In that case, what do? That basically we have to then generate a current account surplus of $100 in order to pay the fellow who wants to leave the country. By the way, I would like you any time to stop me if some argument is not clear. In any case, I'm here for 3 days, so you can just ask me anytime. All right. So if we don't have enough reserves, in that case, if someone wants to take $100 out, then these $100 have to be somehow found. Again, if someone wants to take it out and we borrow these $100, then the net outflow on capital account is zero, because 100 is being taken out and we have borrowed another 100. So, but let us assume that that is not the case, in which case we have to generate a current surplus on the balance of payments in order to make sure that we can finance this $100 outflow. And how do we do that? let us say the current balance is X minus M. We want to raise X minus M by $100. We can't raise exports by $100 because of the fact that, I am assuming that we are already at the existing exchange rate exporting as much as we can, because obviously if we could export more, we would be exporting more. So I'm assuming that exports, given the state of world demand, given the production techniques we have and our competitiveness, given the exchange rate that we have, we are exporting as much as we can. Therefore, we can't suddenly push out $100 more of exports. Then what do? We have to cut down our imports by $100. And how do we cut down the imports by $100? In a regime where you cannot have quantitative restrictions, you cannot just start raising your tariffs, because then that goes against neoliberalism. You can cut down your imports by cutting down your level of economic activity. If imports are a certain proportion, bear a certain ratio to your GDP, in that case, reducing imports can come about only by reducing GDP. And reducing GDP is basically what is called deflating the economy. So any outflow of resources, any outflow of finance gives rise to a deflation of the economy. Okay? And that basically means it gives rise to a larger level of unemployment and a lower level of output than the economy was producing earlier. Now here you may say that, look, okay, but why should we keep the exchange rate unchanged? Because after all, the exchange rate is something which can be manipulated, and therefore, if it is the case that $100 are being taken out of the economy, that basically means that there is an excess demand for foreign exchange, and that should therefore give rise to a depreciation of the exchange rate. Why should we keep the exchange rate constant? We should let the exchange rate depreciate. Thanks. But the problem with the exchange rate depreciation, and this is a point which you find in no books whatsoever, absolutely no books. The problem with the exchange rate depreciation is the following. All right. This is near the board, but anyway, tomorrow I'll discuss it in greater detail if you like, but otherwise I hope it will be clear. Just imagine, suppose we have just two inputs in the, suppose the country is producing one good. We have two inputs. One is an imported input and the other is labor. Okay? So, the price of the product is simply the price per unit of the imported input plus the price per unit of the labor required for producing a unit of the product, together with a certain markup, which is typically the way that pricing is done these days in any market. Do I make myself clear? Okay? All right. Now, suppose we reduce the exchange rate. In other words, suppose it is the case that there is a depreciation of the exchange rate. The depreciation of the exchange rate would give rise to an increase in the rupee price of the imported input. The dollar price is fixed in the international market. Okay? So, if we depreciate the rupee by 10% vis-a-vis the dollar, in that case, the rupee price of the imported input would actually rise by 10%. If we want an effective exchange rate depreciation, in that case, the final good price must not rise by 10%. If foreign exchange price rises by 10%, and if the final good prices rises by 10%, then there's no effective depreciation. Am I making myself clear? Okay. So, if you want an effective exchange rate depreciation, then it must be the case that as the price of the imported input rises by X%, the price of the final good produced in the country must rise by less than X%. Okay? Now, how can that happen? That can happen either if the profit margin goes down or if the real wage rate goes down. Now, typically profit margins don't go down, the markup is fixed among monopolists. Therefore, every exchange rate depreciation, if a nominal depreciation is to result in an effective exchange rate depreciation, must mean a reduction in real wages, must mean a reduction in the real earnings of the working people. Now, this is something which we find from our daily experience, because suppose we have, yes.
So how about the possibility of,
Can you, yeah, bit loud, yeah, Mike.
The share of the imported input would be X percentage of the total cost.
It is embedded in the product. When you are producing a product,
So it's
think of a standard input-output kind of relationship. You are producing a unit of the product. For producing that unit of the product, you require a certain amount of labor input. You require, of course, all kinds of domestic inputs, but they just net out and it makes no difference. And you require a certain amount of imported input. Okay?
So what I'm trying to ask is,
Oil.
So the imported input, let's say, it comes to certain share of your total cost. So let's say 30% or 40%, whatever it is. So the depreciation affects only on this 30% or 40% portion of it, whereas the output depreciation, so the input depreciation.
Actually, no matter how small the share of the imported input is, it's a linear system. No matter how small the share of the imported input is, if you have the imported input cost rising by 10%, then there must be a reduction in either the real wage rate or the profit markup. You see what I mean? The share does not matter. The share may matter in the sense that in the process of working out of this entire system, when the effective exchange rate depreciation becomes zero, because of the fact that your nominal price has increased by 10%, it may take more time. Think of oil. If we depreciate the rupee by 10%, imported oil prices go up by 10%. If imported oil prices go up by 10%, in that case, the commodity into which imported oil enters also, if the price is something which is not to go up by 10%, then it must be the case that your W by P has to go down. And this is true if you take the economy as a whole. It's just the fact that the share of the imported input, if it's very small, then all this works out over a slightly longer period of time. But it's cost push inflation. In a linear system, if you have cost push inflation, then you would have a situation where any depreciation of the exchange rate would give rise to, if any nominal depreciation of the exchange rate would give rise to a real effective exchange rate depreciation, which is what counts, only if there is a reduction in the real wages, assuming, of course, profit markups remain unchanged. It's a very basic proposition. Okay. I think we discussed this proposition in a footnote in our book, which Utsa and I wrote, called Capital and Imperialism. I think you can have a look at it. It's a very simple point. Anyway, so the upshot is, therefore, if you have an exchange rate depreciation, suppose therefore $100 leave the country. If $100 leave the country, in that case you would have an exchange rate depreciation, and the exchange rate depreciation would then give rise 2, a reduction in real wages, assuming the profit markups remain unchanged, which they would. And if so, then you would say that there is a squeeze on the working people. So whether through a deflation or through an exchange rate depreciation, any outflow of finance squeezes the working people. Either they remain unemployed because the economy has been deflated, or they obtain lower wages because the economy has been subjected to exchange rate depreciation, which is inflationary. Okay. Therefore, and the level of activity and generally the conditions of the people is something which is therefore becomes subject to the whims and caprices of globalized finance. Okay, that's the first thing. Any questions on this? Okay. Yes, yes, please. No, sure, but you know, if $100 are going out of the country, if $100 are going out of the country, then I'm assuming ceteris paribus, you can't suddenly accidentally get $100 more of remittances. No, you may rely heavily, but the point is, if $100 are going out, how do you make sure that you get $100 of remittances right at that time? So no, I'm not talking about the mechanism. I'm not saying how it works, but just, you know, if $100 are going out, in that case, it is true that if $100 of remittances came in at the same time, then you would not have a problem. But the point is that there is no reason why $100 of additional remittances should come exactly at that time. Am I making myself clear? I mean, it will be a sheer accident. And if that happened, then Sri Lanka wouldn't be in debt. Then no country would be in debt because they would be relying on remittances. I mean, if you could order if you could order your expatriates to give you $100 extra exactly when the country needed it, of course, very good. But you can't do that, and consequently, we are talking about market adjustments. So any market adjustment in response to an outflow of $100 has to be done on the assumption of ceteris paribus. Am I making myself clear? Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Yes? No? All right. What about the other way? Suppose money comes into the country. In that case, you would argue, all right, you know, when money went out, if people suddenly took their funds out, then you have to deflate the economy. But when money comes into the country, in that case, obviously, it is possible for you to have a high level of output. Therefore, if the two cases were symmetrical, then just as employment and output would suffer when dollars were flowing out of the country, and these are autonomous transactions, these are autonomous capital account transactions. That's the whole meaning of neoliberalism and finance being free to take goods, to take money into and out of the country. That means you have autonomous capital account transactions. And therefore, if finance takes out the country, you have to deflate or depreciate your currency. In either case, as I said, the working class, working people in our country would suffer either through reduced real wages or through reduced employment or both. But then you can say that what about the opposite happening? Suppose finance suddenly comes into the country in large numbers. In that case, surely the opposite should happen. Output should increase and so should employment. But the two cases are not symmetrical. That is the basic thing. That when finance goes out, then if you start from a situation where you cannot meet this outflow through running down reserves, then you have to deflate or depreciate the economy, I mean depreciate the currency or deflate the economy. But on the other hand, when finance comes in, nothing of the sort happens, that you cannot really have an increase in output and employment by the fact of finance coming in. Why not? Let us assume that finance, that I am bringing in $100 suddenly, and I want to convert it into rupees. Okay? If I bring in $100 and want to convert it to rupees, in that case, there is an excess supply of dollars and an excess demand for rupees. In that case, the opposite should happen, then the exchange rate should appreciate. Okay? If $100 are coming in that case, again our current balance must improve by $100. Okay? I mean, you know, in other words, by improve I mean, in the earlier case, we had to enlarge x minus m. In the current case, we have to reduce x minus m. Okay? X, I assume, is given. Let us assume is given. What I am saying is something that would not contradict x. The assumption of x being given would actually, if x is not given, it will strengthen my argument. Okay. In that case, if x minus m has to contract, that means if x is given, our imports should increase. Okay? You can say our imports should increase if our national income increases. Perfectly right. But how would the national income increase? How does the national income increase? The national income consists of C plus I plus G plus the current balance. Okay? C is consumption, which, let us say, assuming a particular income distribution, because I know that, you know, you immediately recognize that the poor tend to consume a larger proportion of their income than the rich. But on the other hand, if for the time being we assume that the income distribution remains unchanged as money is coming in that case, you would find that the consumption propensity, the average, weighted average consumption propensity would remain unchanged. Okay? So C, for any given level of income, C remains unchanged. I, investment. Investment depends upon the expected growth of the market. Now, there is no immediate reason why there should be any larger investment. Besides, as Kaleski had argued, there are always lags in investments. Even if you place order for larger investment today, the actual expenditure on investment goods is something that would occur only after a certain period of time. So investment is given. Always in any given short period, investment is given. I'm talking about a single period. In the single period, therefore, for given income, consumption is given. For given income, investment, of course, is given. And what about government expenditure? Government expenditure is one which depends upon taxes plus the deficit, the tax revenue of the government plus the deficit. If the tax revenue is something which depends upon the level of income, then that means y times small t. In other words, the tax rate multiplied, the average tax rate multiplied by the level of income, plus 3%, which is the current deficit. So the government is in no position to increase its expenditure only because of the fact that some $100 are coming into the economy. Am I making myself clear? Okay. Therefore, there is no mechanism whereby there can be an increase in the level of income and therefore an increase in the level of imports. What would happen in such a case? If $100 are coming in, then since the rupee appreciate, the appreciation of the rupee would make our goods uncompetitive, because obviously appreciation of the rupee would make our goods uncompetitive, and the appreciation of the rupee, because it makes our goods uncompetitive, would mean that our imports would expand. They would expand to a level where they are equal to $100. And this increase in imports is something which actually operates at the expense of our domestic producers. Therefore, the income and employment shrinks when you have the inflow of capital into the economy. This is not something which I'm kind of cooking up. When North Sea gas was discovered, okay, everybody, their confidence rose in the British economy. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. And that basically meant that the pound sterling appreciated. And the appreciation of the pound sterling gave rise to a 13% decline in Britain's manufacturing output. So, the point is that in such a situation, suppose this happens, imagine what is actually happening. What is happening is that $100 have come in, so the country's debt has increased by $100, and this debt has financed your deindustrialization. So it's a debt-financed deindustrialization. You are borrowing to finance your own ruin. Okay. Now this is something which, of course, most sensible governments would avoid. And in fact, the Indian government has avoided it. They would avoid it by keeping the exchange rate unchanged and by adding to the reserves. When someone brings in the $100, the Reserve Bank of India says, okay, you brought in $100, you come to us, we'll give you the rupee equivalent. You don't have to go to the market and then start peddling your dollars for rupees. So there's no question of an appreciation of the exchange rate. Instead, what would happen is that there would be an increase in money supply, and therefore these people who have brought in the $100 would be handed over rupees at the going exchange rate. Okay. Therefore, the inflow of finance is then held as reserves at the going exchange rate, more or less at the going exchange rate. And this is what has happened. I mean, when you look at the huge reserves that India has today, it's because of the fact that we have had foreign currency, FII, that is foreign institutional investors, bringing in dollars, which then the Reserve Bank has held and given rupees in exchange. So the best that can happen to you, yes please.
Sir, so when people like Ashoka Modi are talking about exchange rate depreciation, and he's staunchly criticizing the government's overtime, okay, saying that India's currency is overvalued. Okay, so are they just relying on the fact that the final product price won't increase to the same extent? Because all this is assuming that the final product price is increasing. So given the final product price is not increasing to the same extent, then you may increase your market shares and thereby your economy expands and so on.
You know, on what basis you can say that a currency is overvalued is something which is not a common, there is no uniform criterion on the basis of which you can say a currency is overvalued. There are at least 3 different criteria on the basis of which you can claim that a currency may be overvalued. I don't know what Ashok Modi has in mind. You see, either you can say, whenever there is a balance of payments current account deficit, or in fact an overall balance of payments equilibrium or disequilibrium, the currency may be overvalued. Okay, maybe it is the case that we need a balance of payments equilibrium. We don't want money to keep coming in, and therefore we should actually bring down the exchange rate. That's one possible. As a matter of fact, by the way, the Americans have been arguing that all Asian currencies are undervalued. This is certainly the Chinese yuan is undervalued and the Indian rupee is undervalued, and they say that is why we are getting entry into the American markets. So the proposition that the rupee is overvalued is something. So you can talk about overvaluation or undervaluation in terms of the foreign exchange market. If the foreign exchange market is supposed to clear at a certain exchange rate, and of course if your exchange rate happens to be more than that, then your exchange rate can be said to be overvalued. This idea of an exchange rate, a foreign exchange market clearing, is itself not at all clear, because of the fact that suppose you say that you have an overvalued exchange rate, and therefore you want to reduce the exchange rate. As you start reducing the exchange rate, it's not very clear that it's going to settle down at some equilibrium, because the reduction in the exchange rate may give rise to expectations of a further reduction in the exchange rate, in which case you can have a capital flight, huge capital flight, in which case your exchange rate might actually go on depreciating instead of settling down at an equilibrium. Am I making myself clear? Okay. The second way you can talk about the exchange rate not being an equilibrium exchange rate, okay, whether it's overvalued or undervalued, is of course in terms of inflation, that if you have a certain level of the real wage rate, if you have a certain level of the markup pricing, then only a certain exchange rate, as I was discussing earlier, is compatible with stable prices. Isn't that so? Because, if the exchange rate happens to be any less than that, then you'll have inflation. So you can define exchange rate an equilibrium exchange rate, not in terms of what happens in the foreign exchange market, but in terms of what happens in the macroeconomy, in terms of what happens to your general level of distribution and so on. So if you don't want inflation, non-accelerating inflation, in that case, you can actually have an alternative definition of equilibrium exchange rate. Similarly, you can have an equilibrium exchange rate definition, as I mentioned, with respect to the current account and the balance of payments, or with respect to the overall balance of payments, what gives you an equilibrium. So the idea of an overvaluation or undervaluation of the exchange rate is an idea which I would not take very seriously unless it's very clearly specified what is meant by it. Okay? All right. Now, sorry, a bit louder, yeah.
The financial inflow, why do you think that they cannot act as productive investments?
Financial, how? You tell me. I mean, a financial you see, a financial inflow can give rise to an increase in the level of activity only if it can stimulate some component of the expenditure flow. Consumption is something which is given your level of income. Investment is given in the short term. Government expenditure is again given your level of income. In which case, there is absolutely no way that a financial inflow can stimulate your level of income. And if it does not, then the only way that it can be absorbed, other than the Reserve Bank actually paying you the rupee, I mean, other than the RBI buying the dollars, is through domestic deindustrialization. You see? All right. Okay. Where was I? Yeah. So, the level of activity is one which is generally, therefore, affected, potentially affected. Of course, the best that the RBI or the government, a country's authorities can do is, if there is plenty of money coming in, the best they can do is to make sure that it has no disturbing, no reducing effect as far as the level of income is concerned. If money is going out, in that case, there is nothing you can do to prevent a deflation come depreciation of the exchange rate. Okay? But let us for the time being, therefore, assume that plenty of money is coming in, as has happened in India, as is happening in India. Plenty of money is coming in, and the money that is coming in is one that is being held by the Reserve Bank of India, and therefore there is no problem as far as the exchange rate is concerned. The exchange rate is being maintained. I know it's not being maintained, it's very slowly depreciating, but let's just assume that it is being maintained. In such an economy, what is it that then actually determines the level of income? You just look at the various components of the national income account. Investment would depend upon the rate of growth of national income. But then what determines the rate of growth of national income? What is the autonomous component? The autonomous component is, of course, exports. And that is why the neoliberal economy is one whose rationale consists in actually having export-led growth. Okay, export-led growth may be because the world market is growing, and when the world market is growing, you would have demand for our goods rising, therefore investment taking place, and this investment would then give rise to larger capacity, larger production, and all the rest of it. Alternatively, even within a certain demand for, a certain growth of the world market. Suppose the world market is having zero growth. You may still have growth in your economy if you can capture a larger share of this market. And you can capture a larger share typically through capital from the advanced countries relocating in the low-wage, underdeveloped countries in order to export to the world market. That has been basically the rationale of these neoliberal economic policies which have been tried out. Now, therefore, you would find that, and that's the whole idea of, make in India and this and that. You attract capital by making conditions favorable to capital in the domestic economy so that it locates its production not in America, not in Britain, but in India or in other third world countries and so on, because the wages are cheaper here, and thereby exports to the world market. If they located plants in India to sell in India, then that's no good for us, because that basically means that some domestic producers would be getting uprooted. But if they locate plants in India to sell abroad, then of course that is something that would give rise to a larger level of activity and therefore larger growth rate and so on. So the rationale of the neoliberal economy is that you attract capital in order to ensure that your exports keep growing. Okay. By the way, this is where I'd like to point out that, one assumption invariably made by all the export-led growth theorists is what is called a small country assumption. That means the world demand does not matter. That you are such a small country that if you removed your supply constraints on the exported goods, in that case, you would be able to export as much as you like. So the small country assumption amounts to assuming an infinitely elastic demand for your exports. Okay? And this is something which is fundamentally not correct, and this actually bypasses the problem of the growth of world demand and attracting capital and so on. Now, if you wish to attract capital so that it locates plants here in order to sell in the world market, now how do you distinguish? Okay, there are two kinds of things that you should distinguish between. One is that you would, of course, like to attract productive capital. Attracting finance at the best simply gives rise to larger foreign exchange reserves. I should perhaps make it clear here that you may think that larger foreign exchange reserves are a good thing. Not so, because the larger your foreign exchange reserves, imagine someone is bringing in $100 and the Reserve Bank holds the $100 and gives the money. What gives rupees to the man who has brought in his $100? What does he do with the rupees? He, let's say, goes to the stock market, okay, or he invests it in housing or whatever, and gets a certain rate of return. What would be that rate of return? Minimum 10, 15%, let us say. The reserves which the central bank holds, they earn a rate of return of 1 to 1.5% because they are deposited in Swiss banks. and the Swiss bank gives you an interest rate. I think on average the Indian foreign exchange reserves earn about 1 to 1.5% interest rate. That being the case, even when money is coming in and you are preventing an appreciation of the exchange rate, the country is effectively borrowing dear to lend cheap, okay, which is a drain, all right? So the point is that one has to therefore draw a distinction between the inflow of finance and the inflow of productive capital. The inflow of productive capital is potentially good. The inflow of finance, unless you are in dire straits like Sri Lanka or Pakistan or something, in normal conditions is something which is not necessarily a good thing. But within the inflow of productive capital, then there is this whole business of inflow of productive capital that is for meeting the Indian market, or inflow of productive capital for meeting the world market. If it is for meeting the world market, all right, then you can say that there is an improvement in our exports and therefore higher level of activity. But to the extent that to attract this capital, you have to actually remove all kinds of barriers, mechanisms that you had set up, preventing capital from functioning freely, foreign capital from functioning freely in the economy, or even domestic capital, domestic big capital from functioning freely in the economy. They make encroachments into the small scale sector, they make encroachments into the peasant sector. Agribusiness then sells seeds to the peasants and make sure that the peasants are tied to it in various ways, because of which ultimately the peasants end up becoming worse off. Therefore, how do you distinguish between attracting capital for making exports to enlarge your level of activity and attracting capital for supplanting your petty production sector, supplanting your small production sector, which would actually give rise to unemployment? Within the neoliberal framework, there is absolutely no way of distinguishing between these two cases. Typically, the argument is that we should actually attract capital because it will give rise to greater exports and give rise to a larger level of activity. But when you do that, when you open your country up for capital, then they come in and then supplant your small producers, they squeeze your peasantry and so on, because of which you actually have a decimation of the small production sector. Now this is something which then would give rise to this has an unemployment generating effect. I think I'll talk about it tomorrow perhaps. Let's have some questions. Yeah, okay.
So going by empirical evidence, do you think that FDI, which was high, like around more than 3%, we were doing better in terms of growth and employment the early 2010s compared to where FDI is right now, maybe like very low, under 1%, and we have a huge case of unemployment and maybe comparatively lower growth rates. I haven't checked the empiricals, but would like to know your opinion on it.
One of the problems now is that the growth rate, everybody knows, is highly exaggerated. Because you see, on the one hand, as I mentioned, when capital is coming in, it's coming in, the rationale for it, the justification for it is that it's going to give rise to greater exports. But it is actually supplanting small producers. Now, in the national income estimates, the supplanting of small producers is something that really does not, in the quick estimates, it doesn't even figure. because basically the quick estimates are made on the basis of taking large companies. Okay, the large companies may be doing very well, but the decimation of the petty production sector doesn't figure in it. And then this also continues because, I mean, all kinds of assumptions are made about the small scale sector, which are based on sample surveys and so on, which are not really very reliable. Therefore, the point is that the deindustrializing effects of capital inflows, or the fact that they supplant these small producers, are not sufficiently captured in the national income estimates. As you know, Ashok Modi himself and what is more, Arvind Subramaniam have been arguing that India's national income estimates are highly exaggerated. Arvind Subramaniam, who was obviously the economic advisor to the government of India, actually says that the correct national income growth rate figure should be about 4.5%. In which case, of course, this whole acceleration of the growth rate of the Indian economy between the dirigist period and the neoliberal period is something which is not necessarily valid at all. Coming to your specific question, within the neoliberal period, there are different phases. There was a phase during which you actually had very low growth rates in the 90s and so on. Then you had a brief period in which the growth rates accelerated, partly because the world economy itself was actually doing very well. Then you have a period roughly from around 2012 or so. You see, the crisis, the collapse of the housing bubble occurred in 2008. When the collapse of the housing bubble occurred, the government of India, as indeed very many governments, anticipating a recession in the economy, decided to enlarge their expenditures and go beyond the fiscal responsibility limits. And that is why in India you actually had, instead of a slowing down of the growth rate because of the collapse of the housing bubble, actually a continuation, even an acceleration in the growth rate. The real decline in the growth rate begins only around 2012 or so. Okay. Now, so there are at least three different phases in the neoliberal period. You are talking about one particular, the middle phase when the growth rate was high. There is a subsequent phase when the growth rate is low. And earlier, in 1990s, the growth rate was again very low. And what is more, throughout this period, it's by now not very clear if there has been any acceleration or how much acceleration of growth rate has taken place.
But in relation between FDI and employment?
No, you see, FDI and employment, you cannot just compare in binary terms. You see, first you have to look at the world economy as a whole. Secondly, you have to look at the fact, I mean, what was happening to the small scale sector. Because the bulk of the employment in India, 85% of the employment in India is in the unorganized sector. And therefore, when we find employment rising, in that case, we have to really also look at the unorganized sector, what's happening in the unorganized sector. Okay.
What is the economic rationality of this finance getting an upper hand in the present conjuncture?
No, you see, finance getting an upper hand is not a new phenomenon. Finance getting the upper hand is something which Hobson had written about in 1902. In other words, if you have enormous concentrations of finance in banks and so on, then the idea of finance getting the upper hand is not that surprising. What is true of the current period is finance is international, and countries, the states are nation states. That is why the upper hand is really kind of, so decisive. It's not just, you see, when Lenin was writing or when Hobson was writing, they were talking about finance, a close nexus between finance, industry, and the state personnel. Okay. So the finance's upper hand that time was by controlling the state through the state personnel and so on. While now, the finance's upper hand is not because of these things, finance the upper hand is because the nation state confronting international finance that can move out of your country. Therefore, countries compete against one another in order to ensure that finance doesn't go out of your country. So there's a difference between the upper hand earlier and the upper hand now.
Sir, in a macro perspective, like you have been talking about deindustrialization, and last day in newspapers that we have a current account surplus in service sector. So it is actually attracting capital for an export-led thing, right? So we are actually gaining from it or losing out.
No, but you see, it depends on who you mean by we. You know, I have no doubts that certain sectors of the Indian economy are doing very well. Okay, I mean, obviously, and certain classes of the Indian economy are doing very well. A big capital is doing very well. In fact, they are going around investing all over the world. Okay, now the number of Indian billionaires has really shot up. I have no doubts again that a segment of the upper middle class is doing very well.